I'm going to talk today, my speech today is about the hypocrisy of free speech, and I'm going to talk about the aftermath of the murders in Paris, which occurred last month. When I first wrote this speech at the beginning of the week, I wanted to be very thorough in covering all elements of what happened before, during, and after the attacks. But it ended up being over 2 hours long, and I'm sure that nobody wants to sit and listen to me for that long. So instead, I'm going to focus on a few areas, and hopefully at the end we can have a discussion between us and maybe fill in some of the gaps which I've removed from the speech. So, on the giving away all my pictures. Why has it started? On the 7th of January, two masked men burst into the offices of a satirical magazine known as Charlie Hebdo and killed 10 of its employees, and whilst escaping killed a further 2 policemen. The former deputy director of the CIA called it the worst terrorist attack in Europe since the attack in London in 2005. Conveniently forgetting Anders Breivik, who in 2011 set up a bomb among government buildings in Norway, killing 8 people, and then killed a further 69 young adults with an array of automatic weapons. In the immediate aftermath of this attack in Paris, a staggeringly large amount of information was known very, very quickly about the attackers and their motives. And of course, the claim was made that they did this to protect the honor of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. Eyewitnesses claimed to hear the men say they did this in the name of Islam. It was a just revenge for the cartoons which the magazine had published years earlier. So they claimed, it was a just revenge for the cartoons which the magazine had published 4 or 5 years earlier. But of course, as we all know, the very next issue of the magazine had a picture of the Holy Prophet on the front cover, and this mediocre magazine, which normally sold something like 60,000 copies in France, printed 5 million copies to be sold around the world, as well as having an online edition to cope with the demand of the people who wanted to buy the magazine. So one thing we know for sure is that these murders did nothing to honour the Prophet and did more to drag his name and that of Islam further through the mud with those who claim that Islam is simply a violent ideology. And here in Britain began the latest frenzy of Islamophobic incitement. Demands for communal apologies and explanations and the usual shouting and screaming from people who want Muslims to convince them that we belong here and that people are safe in our midst because just being a Muslim is now a crime. Publicly condemn this, deny links to any extremist groups and their ideologies, stand up and say those men were not Muslim, etc., etc. The normal differences and diversity that you expect to find in any group of people, like class, political ideology, theological interpretation, culture, nationality, etc., all these things apparently do not apply to Muslims. We are all just one big group who are all identical. So if one Muslim does something, then it can be attributed to all Muslims. White people are not all asked to publicly apologize for the arson attacks that occurred all over Europe after the attack in Paris. White people were not asked to apologize when some of them blew up a commercial aircraft out of the skies, killing hundreds of people just last year. Christians not asked to apologize when the American government faked intelligence to attack Iraq, in which 1 million civilians died. People say to me that that was not a religious war. It had nothing to do with religion, so Christians shouldn't feel the need to apologise. So, and hopefully you're going to see this now, I asked them, I always show this picture and ask for an explanation. That is the cover sheet for a security report prepared by a Christian employee of the American government for the Christian president. And there's a picture of Saddam Hussein there, and what is written just above that picture of Saddam Hussein, that's a passage from the Bible. There are a dozen more photos of cover sheets just like this one, of security reports that were read by the American government. All of them with passages from the Old and New Testament emblazoned on the front. It's clear that that was a religious war. The American troops were fighting for the God of the Bible. So shouldn't the Christians be apologizing for the lies? Are Hindus told to personally apologize every time there's a gang rape in India? Or another baby is killed or fetus terminated because it turns out it was going to be a girl? What about the peaceful Buddhists? Do they personally apologize for killing hundreds of Muslims by burning them alive? So here we get to the first point. Should Muslims apologize? An Australian man who I know through work met me at an office in London in that week of the attacks. And he actually used the word, he demanded that I personally apologize. And if I didn't, it was further evidence that Muslims follow and believe a violent religion. He actually sought me out that day because he'd heard that I was coming in, hunted me down to demand this apology. So I told him that I condemned, obviously, what happened, as much as I condemned what Anders Breivik, the Christian, did in Norway just a few years ago. But that I've got nothing to apologise for, as I didn't do anything, because I live in Swindon. I wasn't in Paris that day. I asked him, so I then turned it back on him. I asked him to personally apologise for the abhorrent way the Australian government has treated the Aboriginal population, the indigenous population of the country that they took over. And guess what? He didn't understand why he should personally apologise for that. The point I made was completely lost on him. So usually at this point, I would read some verses from the Holy Quran and mention some actions of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, to prove what these men did was not incited or commanded by our religion, and was in fact the opposite of what our religion teaches. But there's no point in doing that. You all know the verses, and you know how the Holy Prophet acted, and those who attack us do not want to hear it. Or worse, they know and ignore it anyway. Instead, I want to play this audio clip, and it's from the LBC presenter James O'Brien, who gives a masterclass in how to deal with people who demand that we apologise. So hopefully this is going to play now, and you'll be able to hear. Finally, so this bit of audio, trying to get you all concentrated again. Yes. This bit of audio is from LBC Radio, James O'Brien, and somebody's called up and he wants Muslims to all have to personally apologise for what happened.
Richard's in Maidenhead. Richard, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just want to say, I agree with you to a point. I think any reasonable person knows that most Muslims have absolutely no part in this, and that it is a real, a fundamental and a very, very minority group who are doing this. But I think an apology is needed. You said before that if a Geordie person is doing this, should all Geordies issue an apology, and that was kind of a little bit ridiculous. But
why? Why is it any different? Why should Abbas, the last caller, apologise for what these murderers in Paris did?
Well, because I think the alternative is that there is no apology.
Well, you apologised, yeah.
Apologise for what?
The murders in France on Wednesday.
Why would I need to apologise for that?
Well, why does Abbas? He was in Berkshire.
Well, no, because they're doing it in the name of Islam. If something was done...
No, not his Islam. They might have been doing it in the name of Richard's. Wouldn't mean it was about you.
I know, but the...
So why haven't you apologised? You can do it now if you want.
So there has to be some... These people are committing acts of terror in the name of Islam.
Not in the name of his Islam.
I know, I do understand that.
So if I went and blew somebody up now and said I'm doing it in the name of Richards everywhere, you would feel you had to apologise. If that wasn't a shoe bomber called Richard Reed, have you apologised for him yet?
You're making it a bit ridiculous.
No, you are.
I'm really not.
Okay, well tell me why you haven't apologised for the shoe bomber whose name was Richard, because Abbas has to apologise for a terrorist who said he was a Muslim. Take all the time you want, mate.
Okay, so this is from the Islamic community.
Yes, and the shoe bomber was from the community of people called Richard.
We need to feel some sense that there's some action in the Islamic community.
Well, I don't trust people called Richard anymore, so when are you going to apologise?
It's a bit difficult to argue against you when you're doing that. I'm just trying to make a point that these people are from the Islamic community, and there needs to be a sense that...
What does that even mean? Well, what does the Islamic community mean?
You don't understand what Islam is, what the Islamic community is.
Well, I know that Sunni and Shia kill each other every single day in this country on a scale that is nowhere close to what happened in France. So what do you mean by the community? You think they're on the same side, do you? Those people killing each other in Syria at the moment?
No.
So what's the Islamic community?
The Islamic community in this country.
It's just everybody who has the word Islam on their religious affiliations, even if they actually hold murderous intent towards each other, which is bringing us back to Richard. Everyone who's got Richard on their passport is part of the Richard community. You're allowed to admit you've made a mistake, my friend.
No, I'm not going to admit that I've made a mistake. There needs to be a sense that we as a country...
I'm going to interrupt you there, Richard, which I think some might consider an act of mercy.
So, finally you heard that bit of audio. So that was, I think, that was absolutely brilliant. But the shame of it is that even though this Richard was proved wrong, he won't and will never see that he's wrong. His argument was torn apart on national radio, but nevertheless, he will forever carry on in life with that same opinion. So the other major issue brought up again and again is that this is about free speech. And I can say without hesitation that that is absolute nonsense. Olivier Siran used to work for Charlie Hebdo, and he said the following 2 years ago. Islamophobic neuroses gradually took over the magazine after 9/11, which then effectively endorsed attacks on members of a minority religion with no influence in the corridors of power. So it was easy to attack the weak. Those running Charlie Hebdo itself don't really believe in free speech. When they didn't like something, they would have it censored. Philippe Val, who was the editor, criticized Noam Chomsky for what he called excessive criticism of Israel. But worse than that, in 2008, another of Charlie Hebdo's famous cartoonists, Maurice Sinet, known as Sin, he wrote a short note citing a news item that President Sarkozy's son was going to convert to Judaism to marry the heiress of a prosperous appliance chain. Sin added a comment, "He'll go far, this lad." And for that, Sin was fired from Charlie Hebdo on the grounds of anti-Semitism. The magazine, which published disgusting, humiliating pictures of the Holy Prophet, fired someone for writing, "He'll go far, this lad." All the evidence you need that this magazine and its editors were for anything but free speech. They had the right to publish all those extremely derogatory pictures of the Holy Prophet. In France, it seems that this is not a hate crime. It is perfectly acceptable to publish something like that. Now, this is one of the front covers from that magazine, from Charlie Hebdo. I won't give the exact translation to what's said here because it uses a swear word, but it shows a picture of an Egyptian man being killed, and the context of that is the Arab Spring, and it says the Holy Quran is, and then the swear word, rubbish, I'll use instead, as it can't stop bullets. And no one seems to have a problem with this picture, but after the Paris shootings, a 16-year-old produced this picture. It's the exact same thing, but it said that the Charlie Hebdo magazine was rubbish because it can't stop bullets. Now, in light of the real picture, which was published, this fake one should also be fine, which was just produced by someone and put online. No one should have a problem, as it's all about free speech and the right to offend and blah, 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 all that sort of stuff that people come out with. But the 16-year-old was arrested by French police and charged with condoning terrorism. So much for free speech and so much for having the right to offend. A comedian, French comedian, known for his offensive jokes about Jews, was also arrested after making jokes about the Je suis Charlie hashtag, which was trending on Twitter. The Danish newspaper, which in 2005 first published the cartoons that Charlie Hebdo republished of the Holy Prophet, reportedly rejected cartoons mocking Christ because they would provoke an outcry, according to the editor. And they've also boasted that they will under no circumstances publish Holocaust cartoons. During the massacre by Israel of Palestinian children last year during what they called the Gaza War, the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper in Australia published this photo. Jewish man sitting on a chair, enjoying Gaza being blown up. Complaints were made, and the Australian press organisation ruled that the Herald had breached standards. And one of the main reasons for upholding the complaint was that the picture shows the Star of David. You can see it on the back of the sofa there. And this, they said, made it look like it attributed this to the Jewish religion. I would say so much for freedom of speech, but the people who complained and the press and the Australian press organisation seem to think that real life is not allowed to be published. These two pictures were the inspiration for that cartoon. And if you have a look on the man standing there with the flag in his hand, what is that on the flag? That's the Star of David. The worst part of this incident is not that that newspaper apologised twice, or that the press organisation found that they breached standards, but that the editor-in-chief of the Herald and the news director both attended what was described as seminars facilitated by the Jewish Board of Deputies to raise awareness about imagery that could be construed as anti-Semitic. You can say what you like about Islam, but even dare to post a picture of something which actually happened related to Jews, and you're branded an anti-Semite and made to go on a course to make sure that you don't do it again. A blogger in France, she posted a negative review of a restaurant she went to. She didn't like the food and was sued and lost in a French court and was fined for having written a negative review. So you can say what you want about Islam in France, but don't you dare criticize their cuisine. Now, all of those examples pale away compared to what the UN did. In 1999, they decided that they didn't like what the Serbian state television station was broadcasting. So, did they shut it down? Did they go to court to stop them? No. They fired a rocket into the building and killed 10 people. 10 journalists wiped out because the UN didn't like what they published, wounding a further 18 more people. The British government said that the television station was a legitimate target because it was a ministry of lies, stirring up ethnic tension. But by that definition, the UN should be firing rockets into the offices of the Daily Mail. Leaked memos from the Iraq War showed that George Bush and Tony Blair wanted to bomb the Al Jazeera head offices in Qatar because they didn't like the coverage of the Iraq War that Al Jazeera was pushing. Haaretz is an Israeli newspaper, and they published a cartoon which made a point about journalists killed in Gaza by Israel, and they compared it to the killings in Paris. The result of this cartoon being published was a flood of death threats coming in to the newspaper. And here are a few which were posted on Facebook, as reported by MondoWeast.net. We must do what the terrorists did to them in France, but at Haaretz. Why is there no terror attack at Haaretz? Let the terrorists eliminate them. With God's help, the journalists at Haaretz will be murdered just like in France. They should die. Haaretz is where the terrorists should have gone. I hope that terrorism reaches Haaretz as well. With God's help, there will be a Hamas operation that kills all of you, just like the journalists in France. All of that, that's a small snippet of the hundreds of messages. All of that written by Jews, by normal Jewish people, against this Jewish newspaper for daring to post that photo, or for daring to make that cartoon. Did anybody hear about this? Was the term Jewish terrorism used as a headline in major newspapers around the world? Did major newspapers around the world even report that this happened? No. So my question would be, when are ordinary Jews going to stand up and personally apologize for what these people said? I also noted recently with interest that the same people who defend the right of Charlie Hebdo to offend Muslims have also been condemning the Sun newspaper for having topless women on their page 3. That apparently is outrageous and should be stopped, but Charlie Hebdo should be allowed to continue to post what they want about the Holy Prophet. Even Rupert Murdoch apologized after a cartoon was printed in the Sunday Times, which showed Netanyahu building a brick wall containing the blood and limbs of Palestinians. This photo right here. Murdoch tweeted saying, "We owe a major apology for the grotesque, offensive cartoon to Israel." So I guess apologies are only applicable when the Jews are offended. So what can we take from all these examples that I've given? Freedom to offend is fine. It's something people champion. That is until it's something which offends them themselves. But sometimes some people have protection against being offended. Being a Holocaust denier in France is a criminal offence. You can be imprisoned for up to a year and fined tens of thousands of pounds. It's a criminal offence in a number of other European countries. But Islamophobia doesn't seem to be criminalised in the same way. People talk about free speech, but this is nothing more than trying to legitimise hate speech, to push the boundaries of what can be said against Muslims as far as possible. Some journalists crying out that they should be able to say whatever they want, but the reality is much worse than that. In an effort to please investors and shareholders and rich owners, journalists are willingly misleading and distorting their reporting. I'll give you a quick example of something that happened a couple of days ago. A Spanish UN, you probably all know this, a Spanish UN peacekeeper was killed in the disputed region between Lebanon and Israel. Now, it's described by most newspapers as a disputed region, but it's actually a region which Israel illegally occupies and is owned by Lebanon. So this is what the BBC said. The 2 Israeli soldiers killed in the exchange were buried on Thursday. A Spanish UN peacekeeper was also killed. Those 7 words, they're the only thing they said in reporting the death of that UN peacekeeper in their initial article. Now, on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be much wrong with that, apart from the fact that in lumping all 3 deaths together, they're painting the picture that the Lebanese fighters are at fault for the death of the UN peacekeeper. The truth is that it was that the UN have reported that it was the Israeli forces who gunned down this Spanish UN peacekeeper. We need to wonder why the BBC would not report that information despite knowing that that's what happened. Why did they insist instead to try to manipulate us into assuming that something else had happened? Now, this sort of reporting is rife in the media, and that is a far greater worry than some people being allowed to grossly offend Muslims. On the day the BBC covered the Free Speech March which happened in Paris, that was the same day that they decided to cancel a programme which was to be aired on BBC Two because Prince Charles didn't like what that programme was about. So much for freedom of speech from the BBC. The media also wasn't interested in a bomb that went off outside the NAACP's Colorado Springs headquarters on the same day that they were highlighting the attacks in Paris. Colorado Springs is home to some of the most vicious, extremist right-wing activists. It was a balding white man who was seen setting the bomb, according to reports. So the media that did cover it described it as an act of a troubled, lone individual, rather than as a white right-wing Christian terrorist. Few Americans seem to have even heard of this incident, as it didn't make the major news. And barely a line was written about the almost 40 people killed on the same day in Yemen after a suicide bombing. But they were just brown people who were killed. Worse than that, brown Muslim people. So it won't sell newspapers, and it won't have all of Europe mourning for their lost souls. So why bother reporting it with any vigour? Fox News had specialists on their show. And one said that, and you probably all know this as well. One of these specialists, who stood in front of the US Senate and given evidence on Islamic extremism, he said that Birmingham was 100% Muslim and a no-go zone for non-Muslims. 100% Muslim. Another expert said that 750 areas of France are completely Muslim and no-go zones. Both of those testimonies given by these specialists were complete lies. Birmingham is 77%. So 70% of the population of Birmingham are non-Muslims for a start. And you know, it was so obvious that these were lies that Fox News had to apologise for what these experts had said. But here's the thing, the apology doesn't really matter because Fox News had a specific agenda in mind when they brought these people on. And that was to put the term no-go zone into the American conscious, to try to separate Muslims away from non-Muslims, to say, look, they come, they take our land, they set themselves up, you know, they're separate from us, they're scary, we need to worry about them. And somebody made a video of the number of times the term was used in just 2 days and reporting on Fox News. So now, fingers crossed, I'm going to try to play that video. Let's see if this actually works. Right, so this video is basically a supercut of every time the word no-go zone was used. 2 days, in 2 days.
Okay, none of what you're about to see is a repeat. These were all individual times they said this. This is what Fox News does professionally. They are professional liars. And you just saw that I got disproven. Listen to how many times they referenced it.
No-go zones, no-go zones. So there are no-go zones.
No-go zones.
No-go zones.
No-go zone means
The no-go zone.
No-go zones.
750 no-go zones.
The no-go zones.
No-go zones are
No-go zones. No-go zones.
no-go zones.
No-go zones.
Will there be no-go zones here? Are they there now? No-go zones.
Okay, we keep talking about the no-go zones in France here.
Are these no-go zones? They live in the no-go zones. The no-go neighborhoods and no-go zone.
No-go zones.
No-go zones.
No-go zones.
The no-go zones.
No-go zones.
These 751 no-go areas.
No-go zones. No-go zones.
No-go zones. No-go zone. You have no-go zones.
A no-go zone. These are no-go zones. In these no-go zones, no-go zones, no-go zones, no-go zones is no-go zones. In the no-go zones, the no-go zones, no more no-go zones.
No-go zones. I think they've reached critical mass, frankly. And I've said this before, I think Europe is finished.
Europe is finished. That was the message. So despite the fact that it was an absolute lie about Birmingham, there's no 750 areas of France where it's only Muslim population, despite the fact that they'd apologized publicly because it was such an egregious lie, that's what they did. 2 days of reporting, hundreds of times reused the same term, no-go zones, to put it into the conscience of people, to put a divide between Muslims and non-Muslims. So apology or no apology, Fox News got what they wanted from the story, more hatred of Muslims. We are told repeatedly that Muslims are always the ones who commit the terrorist acts. I hear the saying all the time that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. That's thrown in my face on a daily basis. But is that true? Or is this just another myth hyped up by the media attention that's put on Muslims? I had a look at the stats for the last 5 years of terrorist attacks. In Europe, in the last 5 years, according to Europol, less than 2% of all terrorist attacks were by Muslims. Less than 2%. 2. That's it. So the vast majority of terrorists are not Muslims. But Muslims get the biggest press coverage because that sells newspapers, it gets people watching cable news, and that makes money for the investors and the shareholders and makes people like Rupert Murdoch very, very rich. So this is what Muslims are up against. A fiercely Islamophobic media who have no problem printing or broadcasting absolute lies about us and our faith, and the gullible people lap it up. And try going online. Try going, for example, go to Twitter and see the thousands, tens of thousands of people who on a daily basis post messages about how all Muslims need to be killed. Now, just to give a taste of the hypocrisy that surrounds all of this, there was, I touched on it earlier, there was a march in Paris in the aftermath of the killings. The same Paris, by the way, which earlier last year had banned people from attending a pro-Palestine march, had no problem for this free speech march. Around 1 million people attended, along with 50 of the world's leaders, attending to stand up for freedom of speech. Sounds fantastic. David Cameron attended the rally for freedom of speech and press, despite the fact that his government raided the offices of The Guardian and destroyed documents and computers and threatened journalists with prosecution because they didn't want them to publish certain stories. The same David Cameron, who right now wants to monitor and record everything that everybody says. And he wants encrypted communication like iMessages and WhatsApp banned. That sounds like the complete opposite of freedom of speech to me. Netanyahu of Israel, he attended, even though he was asked not to. And even though his forces killed 17 journalists in Gaza just last year, 17 journalists, where's the 1 million people marching for them? Do people even know that happened? King Abdullah of Jordan was there, despite the fact that Jordan just recently sentenced a journalist to 15 years hard labour in prison because they didn't like what he reported. Prime Minister of Turkey, he was there, despite the fact that Turkey puts in prisons more journalists than any other country in the world. The Foreign Minister of Egypt, where several journalists from Al Jazeera are currently in prison. The list goes on and on and on. Russia, Algeria, the UAE, Tunisia, the USA, all countries which have journalists in prison because those governments didn't like what the journalists had written. But in the end, we as Muslims have only one role to play in all of this, and it's a very simple one, and it's been laid out to us in the Holy Quran. We must live our lives as good, honest, and just people. And when we encounter those that hate us, or mock our faith, we should ignore them and carry on. For it is Allah, and only Allah, who can judge mankind. And He will, when the time comes for all of us. The Holy Prophet himself, peace be upon him, said, "For you is your life, and for me is mine." I'm paraphrasing that, he said it slightly differently. But that's the sentiment that we should carry with us. I want to end with something which a lot of people don't know about. And it's that there is actually a very, very prominent picture or statue of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, in America. It's been there for years, I think 70 years or something. And it's actually inside the walls of the US Supreme Court. Just above the press seating area is something called the North Wall Frieze. And it's dedicated to the great lawgivers of law, as they describe it. And it has a portrait to the development of law throughout history. And one of the men whose statue is on this frieze, or his depiction of on this frieze, is the Holy Prophet, who stood there with the Holy Quran in one hand and a sword in the other. A gesture from the US Supreme Court and the United States to how important the Holy Prophet was to mankind. So I thought I'd end with that little snippet of information